Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talking Star Wars EU. Today, I've got a good friend of mine and editor of Supernatural Encounters, one of my favorite Star Wars works there is, with me to talk about the Star Wars Expanded Universe. I'm really excited about this. We'll probably talk to him again in the Supernatural Encounters interview series with Marcel some other time. But today, I've got Mr. Corey Carter to talk about how he got into the Star Wars Expanded Universe. Thanks for joining me for this. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. As you know, I'm a big fan of your work. So, yeah, very happy, very excited, very nervous.
So am I, because you have a great mind for Star Wars. I mean, you kind of have to edit a book as monstrous in size and scale as Supernatural Encounters. So we're going to talk about how Corey got into the Star Wars universe. So, what is your first memory of Star Wars?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, my parents used to take me around to places like garage sales, Sunday markets, that sort of things, where you could pick up a lot of secondhand books and you could just get like a whole box of them for just a couple of dollars. And I ended up finding this little-known series, you may have heard of it, called the Jedi Prince Young Adventure novels.
Yeah.
And I read them and I thought, what the hell is this? This is from a movie? And so I asked my parents and they got me into it. And I am, of course, lying through my teeth right now. I just wanted to give you some hope that I might have something unique and interesting to offer, but I have the most generic origin story of any Star Wars fan of my age. I'm in my 30s, so like most people, basically my parents got me into the original trilogy. And I was so young when I first watched it that I had no memory of watching it for the very first time. It was just sort of something that I have always had, and it's been there and I've been aware of it. And evidently I really quite enjoyed it. I got the Nintendo 64 and my parents got me the Rogue Squadron game.
Nice.
And I would get home from primary school every day and I would just play the exact same levels over and over and over again constantly. Probably played the whole game about 10 or so times. Weirdly enough, that because they have a bonus Dark Empire level at the end of that,
Yes.
that was how I learned that the Emperor had somehow Palpatine returned. And that was how I learned about things like world devastators and the like. That was long before I'd ever so much as touched a comic book. And from there, I basically, the part about going around to these secondhand book sales and picking stuff up, that part was at least true, albeit a little bit later down the timeline. So I would get, the 1,000,001 books written by Jude Lawson. Jedi Apprentice and Jedi Quest, the Galaxy of Fear series. That was a fun one at a time where everyone my age was reading Goosebumps.
Yes.
There was a Star Wars alternative there and ready for me. The Young Jedi Knights, the sort of early introductory adventures of Jason and Jaina and Anakin. So I've always had a fondness for those characters as people who have with me, as it were. And from there, I basically moved on to the most sort of common entry point into the broader EU, which was the Thrawn trilogy. My parents picked those up for me while I was still in primary school, but sort of towards later primary school. So I'm starting to pick up more serious adult novels. They got that for me. I was completely hooked. And from there, I just sort of continued to delve into it. Like I said, when I was sort of younger and didn't have much money of my own and was sort of relying on my parents buying things for me,
Yep.
I would just surf the book. Once we got the internet at the house, I was just hungry for more.
Yep.
No matter how much I read, I need more, 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 more. And so I'd just sit there scrolling through Wikipedia articles, and that's how I found out about weird things like the Marvel comics, the original Marvel run, that is, that started alongside the production of the original trilogy movies, and all these kinds of weird esoteric corners of the EU. And then obviously once I got older, started having money of my own, I'd buy the new novels as soon as they came out and
Yeah.
sort of kept up with it from there.
That sounds like a great journey into Star Wars. If it had started with Jedi Prince, that would have been the craziest starting point I think I'd ever heard. So adds up, but I assume you did eventually read Jedi Prince, albeit after the movies and not before them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this sort of touches on one of the things that I loved most about Star Wars growing up. From my perspective, obviously, being that young, I hadn't sort of delved out more broadly into the genre and sort of understood what was out there. But it just blew my mind that there was a single universe.
Yes.
Where you had, the events of the movies, but also these novels that could be quite serious in their tone. There's areas of Star Wars and the expanded universe that are sort of more hard military sci-fi.
Yeah.
And then you go fully down the rabbit hole, and there's, the Marvel comics, the Dreams of Cody Sunchild remains to this day, even with the added context that SE provides, one of the most fever dream-like experiences that I've ever encountered anywhere. The Jedi Prince series and this idea of Palpatine having a mutant three-eyed son who may be a villain, but he's still capable of love. And without three eyes, Palpatine could never achieve perfection, and all this kind of weird nonsense. But the thing that I loved about it beyond that was that you had this dedicated cohort of reference authors who were basically, they grew up on this stuff, and they grew up on it when it was coming out. And they were determined to sort of acknowledge and respect it and rehabilitate it within, the sort of broader mainstream fandom. So you had people like Joe, Rich Handley, Abel Pena, Jason Fry, Daniel Wallace, people like that, who would write these articles that were intended to help make additional sense of these things. And we saw that with things like game magazines, hyperspace articles. Towards the end of the EU, we were in a bit of a golden age with the Star Wars blog, where basically this massive backlog of unpublished materials, they obviously never found a way to recycle them. And at some point, someone somewhere along the chain just decided, hey, we'll publish these for free online for the fans. And that was very much a golden age. Things like Spin Declassified helps sort of make sense of Trioculus within that broader context, and all these other sort of weird and esoteric characters.
Yeah, those articles were great. It was like, I think that Joe and Rich and Abel, all those guys were kind of like gardeners. They were, trimming up bits of the EU, making sure it stayed really nice, trim a bit off here to keep the plant overall looking just flourishing. They kept it alive by making sense, like you said, of some of those just wacky off the walls stuff that the 70s brought us with the Marvel comics, and kind of making sense of it, making it all fit together. So as you were transitioning from the movies to these novels, you were going from the young reader stuff with Jude Watson and Galaxy of Fear to, like you said, the more adult novels for older audiences. What novels, what couple stories in these books that you were reading struck a chord with you as some of your favorites? Where would you go to in describing some of your favorite parts of the expanded universe in the novels and young readers novels?
That's an excellent question. I watched some of your previous Talking EU videos to sort of get a feel for what kind of questions you might bring up. And there are a lot of them where, what's your favorite this, what's your favorite that? And it's like asking me to choose my favorite child or a parent to choose their
Yep.
favorite child, since I'm not one myself. There's just so many. But when it comes to novels, there are definitely some standouts. My absolute all-time favorite is and remains Yoda Dark Rendezvous. And I'm not just saying that because I know Joe will probably end up watching this. It was my favorite long before I ever met him. It's a really, it is a really emotional and heartfelt novel that really gets Yoda as a character and
Yes.
sort of reconciles the prequel's depiction of him as, the Jedi Grandmaster in his prime with his OT depiction as a sort of impish,
Yes.
mischievous kind of little bit of a weirdo. And the other characters in that are also great. It introduces some minor characters, or at least fleshes them out. And Sean Stewart just knocked it out of the park in terms of creating new characters that you truly felt for. And there's some very heartwarming and very heartbreaking moments in there. I think pretty much everyone who has ever picked up that book ever has just fallen in love with Scout, for example.
Yes.
I don't know a single person on the planet. Maybe that's just because I'm sort of sheltered and living in the wrong bubble. But I don't know anyone who doesn't like Scout. And when it comes to Star Wars, it can be very, very rare for there to be a consensus that emerges.
Yes.
There's always contrarians or people who hate this or hate that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's you can tell that he did a great job there. Some other standouts for me are Darth Plagueis. Pretty much anything by James Luceno is a masterpiece. There's really no other way to describe it. Every book is his magnum opus.
Yeah.
But Darth Plagueis sort of stands out above the rest just because it felt like a love letter to lifelong EU fans. It is just, Luceno has always been fantastic for bringing in obscure references, but this one was just a tapestry weaving together so many novels and comics and this and that, and ties into the movies in a way that takes Phantom Menace, which is probably, I think most people share my opinion on this, the weakest of the prequel movies.
Yeah.
And it really, really boosts it quite significantly. And that's been the case with a lot of Luceno's novels like Cloak of Deception, Labyrinth of Evil, things like that, where they really enrich and enhance the prequel trilogy in quite substantial ways, to the point where you will never watch those movies the same way again after reading his novels.
Yeah.
Another standout is Kenobi.
I love that book.
I wish they'd just adapt that, Disney. You want to do a thing about Kenobi, adapt that, because that is the gold standard. In a sort of an expanded universe of very big galactic threats, it was very grounded, down to earth, or I suppose down to Tatooine story that was sort of more focused upon individual characters and the interactions in their lives. And that's where, John Jackson Miller, who wrote it, he's, probably one of the best character authors out there in terms of the EU. He has a great capacity to, create unique personalities that really shine through and sort of bounce off each other in a lot of weird and interesting ways. And some honorable mentions to Shadows of Mindor. It's a bit more of less of a consensus-y one. A lot of people, some people just don't like it very much, but I absolutely loved it. And Solo Command, he's probably my favorite X-Wing novel.
Nice. Great choices all across the board. I love that you went to Dark Rendezvous, because that's Joe's favorite. Another pillar in the expanding universe community, Christopher Nelson, who's a big-time collector, big-time fan, also points to that as his favorite. So I just absolutely love the love that Yoda Dark Rendezvous has been getting as of late. You talked about how heartfelt it can be. Like I recall crying reading conversations between Yoda and young Dooku, knowing what's to come. It's emotional, and like you were saying, connections to the characters. And with Kenobi, you're talking about it being grounded, refreshing, change of pace. You pointed to some absolutely fantastic novels there. Um, in regards to the comic side of thing, you mentioned that when you played Rogue Squadron, you hadn't touched comics yet, but you were starting to hear allusions to stuff that you'd hear later on in Dark Empire. When did you start delving into the comics, and what did you think when you got to Dark Empire? That is a divisive one, hotly contested in the fandom. Everyone has their thoughts on it. So what did you think as you were getting into the expanding universe comic books?
Yeah, comics was something that came a lot later for me. We didn't have a local comic book store around where I lived. Obviously, these single issues, they charge an arm and a leg for them. It's usually worth saving up for the trade paperback or the omnibus or what have you.
Yeah.
So I didn't get into them until much later. And like I said, I was always hungry for more and was constantly on the look. So a lot of these stories I ended up learning about secondhand through these sorts of summaries. And it wasn't until I was much older and at a newsagent's, I was there when the first issue of the KOTOR comic came out. So obviously I got into comics a bit later than, all these other things. But I thought, okay, issue 1, I'll pick this up. I'll go with that and sort of dip my toe in the water, see how it is. And yeah, the water was warm. It was absolutely fantastic. And that sort of kicked off a growing interest in the comic side of things, not just from the sort of story elements that I might glean from it from book pages, but to actually experience and enjoy these stories firsthand. Like I said before with Kenobi, John Jackson Miller is an amazing character writer, and he was more heavily involved on the comic side of things, as you obviously know. And yeah, he's yet to produce a single thing that I didn't think was absolutely fantastic. And then from there, I just sort of took recommendations of what was good and what was sort of worth chasing up. So the Republic Comics,
So
John
good.
Ostrander. John Ostrander is another absolutely phenomenal writer. He wrote the defining Quinlan Vos arc, as far as I'm concerned. Just a lot of absolutely amazing arcs within that run. And yeah, I got into Dark Empire as well alongside that. I have mixed feelings on this one. I think a large part of my original lack of enjoyment at the time was the art style. And that's, a complaint that a lot of people have sort of picked up on. It's the coloring is weird, very generic appearances, to the point where, sometimes it becomes confusing as to who exactly is who. You have them all in a group shot together and dialogue bubbles are popping up from completely identical faces. You're just sort of lost as to what on earth is going on here. And obviously, like I said, I learned about Palpatine returning and these things like World Devastators, which I think are very, very cool in terms of super weapons. When I was a much younger kid, playing the Rogue Squadron game. So it wasn't something that completely, caught me off guard, and I thought that this was a completely weird thing and hacky writing or anything like that. There are probably some things that I would have done differently if I were writing it. But yeah, I don't hate it as much as other people do. I've grown to like it over the years. With sort of time and having it as an assimilated piece of this interconnected, expanded universe that has been continued to be built on over time. Special apologies to Marcel that I didn't have anything more glowing to say about it than that. But I do at least like it now, so don't come at me.
Yeah, it's been a journey, but it's like that, I think, for certain pieces of the EU with different expanding universe fans. Uh, you made a great point with kind of it's an integral part of the larger story. So do you think that even perhaps less stellar pieces of the expanding universe can kind of be lifted up by the interconnectedness of the storytelling? Since it's a part of things, we kind of grow to accept it, that it exists there, and sometimes grow to like it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just talking about this on the Discord a couple of days ago. Crimson Empire 3, not exactly a
Mm,
spicy hot take here, but I hate it. I hate it with a deep and burning passion. And obviously, that was a much anticipated series. Obviously, they had
yeah.
the first two that were absolutely phenomenal, fan favorite classics. And then they'd been sort of hinting and alluding
Mm,
to how Kirk Canos's arc might be taken forward beyond that. For anyone who doesn't know, he was a surviving royal guard who was out for revenge against those that he perceived as having betrayed the now finally fully dead emperor.
mm,
And he obviously he'd scratched everyone off his list except for Luke.
mhm.
And so it felt like it was going to be culminating in some big showdown between these fairly epic legendary characters who had been built up to some degree. And then Crimson Empire 3 comes along, throws all of that out, introduces some complete random who is such a complete and total jerk that it
Yeah.
leaves Panos. It destroys Canos's remaining faith in the Empire and causes him to give up his quest. On top of that, it has truly some of the worst art that I've ever seen, and I do apologize to the artist because it's not as though I myself could do any better in that regard. But what they did to the Solo children, there's a panel that has them looking like kids out of that Scream painting.
Yes, I know what you're
That's an
talking
infamous
about.
one. Yeah, I've shared that one particular panel more times than I can count. I have it somewhere saved on my computer just so I can whip it out when I need it. As an example of just how bad and atrocious that series is. That being said, sort of going back to the Star Wars blog, which we mentioned earlier, one of the articles that they released was something called the Imperial Warlords Despoilers of an Empire. And
Yes.
it was basically gave profiles for all of the post-Endor warlords, and one of them was
Mhm.
Enix Devian, who was the aforementioned jerk from earlier. And they tied his story to a bunch of really, really, really obscure Star Wars lore, and they went hard. They tied him to the mysterious quote-unquote Death Star 3 from Star Tours and explained that in a way that made sense. They tied him to the Corinth Dissension from
Yes.
Wegg's adventure journals.
Yep.
There was, an imperial faction there, and it had a mysterious shadowy leader that was sort of a co-founder alongside people who had appeared in the actual adventure themselves. They go unnamed. And that plot thread was sort of never picked up from there, and it was just always a mystery as to who this person was. Save for the fact that they were also involved in attacking their fellow Imperial forces as well as the New Republic. And then, Dan Wallace and Abel Pena came along and they tied that up all together in a bow, made it nice and pretty. And it really elevated that story and that character, not to the point where I like the actual comic itself, but I'm more comfortable and happy with it being part of the sort of broader tapestry of the EU.
Yeah. A connection or reference for people like you and me who just love the integrated connections back and forth. Something like that is enough to make it be like, oh, it's all right. I can accept it. And I just covered the Corinth dissensions in my last breakdown, so that was fresh on my mind. I'd forgotten that there is that tie from the Dissensions to that character from Crimson Empire 3. Brilliant stuff from the minds of these writers. And Joe Bongiorno is perhaps the crowning mind of them all in terms of connections like these. When did you meet Joe?
Yeah,
and get to come across him for the first time?
Yeah. So as I mentioned in that final year of the EU, we were in a bit of a golden age where all of these unpublished things that had sort of some of which had been announced, some of which hadn't, were finally being released to the public on the Star Wars blog. And I was familiar with a lot of these stories that hadn't made it out there because, like I said, some of them had been announced publicly and it said, hey, this was going to appear here, and then it was cancelled. And cult encounters and supernatural encounters were part of that list. And alongside such things as Abel's Vader Legacy, it was one of the things that I was eagerly awaiting appearing on the Star Wars blog when the time finally came. Because there was very much this feeling of optimism and excitement at the time that they're finally giving us everything. And obviously it didn't pan out that way. The Disney acquisition occurred. They ended up cancelling the Star Wars blog in its then current form and sort of reorienting it towards promotion of the sequel trilogies. They sort of stopped largely giving us more EU, save for some sort of lingering holdouts that were were still in various stages of development at the time, and it was worth sort of just pumping them out there before they wrap things up. I'd known of cult and supernatural encounters. I'd been eagerly awaiting those, and then they were sort of snatched away from my sort of perspective at the time. And then I heard that Joe was still continuing to work on them, and I thought, okay, well, that's quite interesting. And then he published the what he now refers to as the beta version of Supernatural Encounters, which is a quarter, a fifth of the size of the final product.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very rough gem by comparison to the polished final product. But at the time, my mind was completely blown by this thing. Thought there was so much cool stuff in there. Finally, some love for those weird bedlam spirits that, they sort of fall into that vein of these things are canon, but they're over here. So I really enjoyed that. And then I heard that he was continuing to work on it. And he was creating an expanded version that had included cut content that he wasn't able to get into the original beta version. I thought, okay, that's fairly interesting. And then from there, sort of two things happened. The first was that I was continuing along with Disney canon. I'm sure you can imagine my disappointment there. It was things got heated at the time, obviously. Things were very divisive there within the fandom, within the community, and I sort of largely stepped away from fandom at that time. I sort of still followed along with various novels and things, and to be fair, there are some Disney novels that I quite enjoy. There's definitely some things that I like there. I don't sort of hate it and throw it all out with throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. But I was a bit burned out on the fandom. I was a bit burned out on Star Wars. I was very much had this feeling that the heyday was behind us. Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, Joe was continuing to work on Supernatural Encounters, and obviously it was a very, very long wait. And to sort of tide people over in the meantime, he would do things like have AMAs. He released the table of contents publicly, so we could sort of look at these chapter headings and imagine what might be in there. And like I said, he gave these AMAs where he was saying things about what would potentially be included there. And he mentioned, firstly, the sort of foreign language RPGs, which were something that I've been trying to hunt down and collect to the best of my ability. And another was this idea of for lack of a better term, a broader Lucasverse. So not just Star Wars existing within its own continuity within the canon of Lucas's works, but rather this idea that all of the LucasArts films, the Lucasfilms movies would potentially have occurred in some way, shape, or form within the Star Wars universe, and also Lucas games as well, which I found quite interesting. So basically, this gave me something to do to keep the flame alive. I would sort of just, as a casual fan, I would I'd comb through the table of contents and I would see if I could come up with any interesting insights there. And I would go through all of Lucas's movies and all of the watch playthroughs of all of the games that had nothing to do with Star Wars. And I was quite surprised by not only the depth of lore there. For example, the LucasArts games, the early ones, they include sort of subtle Easter egg references to one another, giving the implication of a sort of more interconnected and tied in universe amongst the various Lucas games. And basically, I had this big list of lore, all of these things that I was wondering about, all of these things that I felt could potentially fit. And eventually I just finally decided to reach out to Joe and I said, hey, I want to be a contributor to this because I've been really impressed by your work and I'd like to get a hard copy by the end of it. And from there, we just got to chatting and I didn't know what was going to be in SE, but I would pass him along notes on things that I'd found from really, really obscure corners. And I didn't know what he needed or where it would fit. So I was basically just throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what would stick. I'll give you all of my stuff and then you can just decide what you want to do with it. And on top of that, I was sort of asking, because Joe, he's always been very approachable, very friendly, always eager to have a chat with his fellow Star Wars fans about shared passions and, pretty much anything else. He's very down to earth and friendly guy. And I was sort of asking him questions about things that I'd managed to discover just from the table of contents. I managed to discover a certain crossover based, I'm not going to say which one, but based just off the name of a particular Earthworld. And so I think that sort of caught him off guard as well. So as we're getting to know each other, he's sort of saying that, this guy is very knowledgeable. He has good research skills. I at least like to think that I'm quite friendly to deal with, and apparently he agrees. So just sort of all of these traits, the stars align, and eventually he reached out to me. He said, look, would you be interested in coming aboard as an editor? And, the rest is history from there. I mean, obviously I wasn't going to say no to that.
Oh, absolutely not. That's an awesome journey to get to that point, to become an editor on such an amazing book. But you have your own supplement to Supernatural Encounters, and that is the Supernatural Encounters Atlas Appendix. You've got the cover art for it back there behind you. What would eventually become the cover art for the book is back there behind you on your screen. How did that come into being? And what was the writing process for that like?
Yeah, so there were a couple of elements to that. The first is that I was a big fan of the Essential Guides back during the EU, and obviously one of the big ones there was the Essential Atlas. And that took on the seemingly impossible task of creating a comprehensive map and placing every single planet that had ever been mentioned in any source ever since 1977.
It's wild. Great book.
Yeah, it is a truly insane undertaking that I thought would frankly be impossible by this point. But yeah, Jason and Dan, my hat goes off to them because they somehow managed to pull off such a truly crowning achievement there. And that's been important sort of storytelling architecture going on since then. I understand that they still continue to use the Atlas even under Disney, and Jason has announced in the past that there's potentially going to be an update to the official version at some point, which is something I'm very excited for. But what struck me about that, because I wasn't exactly a big Atlas junkie, I'm not particularly a map guy myself, but what struck me about that was that it did the heavy work of fixing a lot of things that were mistakes, and it created some sort of storytelling architecture that would prevent sort of future continuity issues. Because before all of these planets were given a specific placement, there may have just been some vague allusion to where they were in some story somewhere. And people wouldn't realize that, they would forget about it, and then some author would come along and put in a completely contradictory placement. So there's a lot of, fixing up and cleaning up messes, and then providing the infrastructure going forward to make sure that future errors of that type wouldn't occur. So I was very impressed with it from that kind of standpoint. What I was also impressed by was how it also enabled storytelling, because you have a bunch of these planets that hadn't been placed anywhere within the gap. They just kind of exist within a vacuum. They appeared in one particular comic here, or some obscure book there, and then they just kind of sit there as sort of free-floating atoms just whirling about. And what Jason did and Dan with the maps was that they sort of put these things into clusters where we understand where they are in relation to one another. And that created sort of these areas with storytelling potential. So one of the examples there is the so-called Foundry of the Confederacy, which is where Jason and Dan took a bunch of separatist mechanical foundry worlds, shipyards and the like, and they'd put them all in this one big cluster up along the Polemian, I think it was. The Polemian or the Hydian, but either way, it created this area that was rife as its own unique setting for military campaigns and stories of that nature. And he would go on to flesh that out further in the Essential Guide to Warfare, similar to the sort of post-Endor campaigns where he had this map of all of the different paths that the New Republic took as it was trying to encircle the Empire in the core. And then in Warfare, they created this highly detailed breakdown where every sort of line corresponded to a particular admiral and general, and here's the campaigns that they're waging, here's who they're up against. So I was sort of impressed by its ability to enrich storytelling as well as just sort of cleaning up storytelling messes. Anyway, to sort of take that long-winded tangent and bring it back to the actual question that you asked, it's no secret, if you've read it, that Supernatural Encounters introduces a lot of locations, a hell of a lot. And there's potentially even more if you sort of extrapolate further from there. If you're the kind of person who likes these crossovers, you might potentially want to bring in some more places from that particular thing. If there's a particular alien species that was introduced, it stands to reason that their home world might also exist within the Star Wars
also
galaxy,
exist out there,
Yeah. And I was basically taking all of these notes as I was going along. And one of the things that I sort of found was that a lot of these, there was no sense of place to them. And as an Atlas fan, that was something that I was very much interested in. And even though at the end of the day, all I really did was create a spreadsheet, I knew that there were some fans out there, much like myself, who would be very, very interested in that sort of thing. On top of that, I found that when it comes to continuity errors within Star Wars, about 80 to 90% of them boil down to either a lack of understanding of time or a lack of understanding of place. What I mean by that is, if you don't have a clear and coherent timeline, then you're going to establish facts that completely contradict that timeline. And Joe's obviously got a much firmer grasp than I or anyone else does on that. He literally runs a timeline website, and a lot of what Supernatural Encounters did in terms of cleaning up messes was reconciling some of these really weird and anachronistic dates in a way that was hopefully satisfying and made sense, and also was narratively enjoyable as well, because he sort of tied them, created sort of stories around these contradictions to help explain them. The other one, as I mentioned, is a lack of a sense of place. And like I said, if you don't know where something is, you don't know how it connects and ties into the other places around it. And that potentially creates room for messes to be cleaned up down the line. And that was something that we weren't doing internally. And so I sort of set about the... I just sort of reached out to Joe and I said, hey, what do you think about potentially doing this as a little spin-off on top of SE as an additional reference material for fans so that they can help sort of place some of these locales that have been introduced? He said, yeah, that would be fantastic and that would be great. And yeah, we took it up from there.
And thus we have the Atlas Appendix, which is really great, really well documented, really well formatted. I really like it. I've already used it several times in my reading of Supernatural Encounters. It's nice to see where something is or think, didn't that have another name? Because name changes, all that kind of stuff in Supernatural Encounters. So it's a really helpful guide to have for going through.
Yeah, that was something that I was forgetting from earlier. Was I mentioned that I was taking a lot of notes while I was an editor, and a huge pile of those were just keeping track of the name changes over time. And
I can imagine.
What turned into what. Yeah, and I sort of when I looked at that and I went to myself, well, if I need separate notes just for this, it probably stands to reason that most readers will as well, and we should probably have some handy, accessible, ready-to-use reference guide there that people can take advantage of. And some people have been kind enough to say that they tend to keep it open on their laptop in the background while they read their hard copies, and whenever they find something that's sort of nagging at them, it's a bit familiar, they'll type it into there and they'll go, oh, it's that. That's very flattering, because as I said, from my perspective, I just, I made a table. I put a lot of effort and time and energy into that table. But, that's, it doesn't compare to some of the other things that people have made.
I'd say it's a very handy table. It's one that I'm excited to have, printed out somewhere on this shelf. Because, I kept having to use it. As I was reading Supernatural Encounters, I kept thinking, with the name changes, surely they must have had someone to keep track of this. Because, man, there's just so many. It's hard to remember what becomes what and what becomes what. So it's gratifying to hear that, yes, you were keeping track of that with a little list of all of the name changes there.
Yeah, well, it's very much a team effort, because obviously Joe had a broader team of editors, not just myself. Edward, Kyle, Patrick, Robert, Harry, and some others who were a bit before my time coming on the team. They're all just rock stars who know so much about Star Wars, and we've all hopefully contributed in a significant and meaningful way.
From everything I've heard from all of the editors, there is a great camaraderie, a great synergy between all of you in regards to getting this work done. I imagine that had to happen to get such a magnanimous, just huge work out there. Did everyone kind of have their own roles for what they were editing, their own niches that they fell into, kind of in regards to maybe what was their specialty? You were keeping track of name changes. I'm imagining there were some who were more on grammar, more on lore. You need someone for a lot of stuff with a work of this size.
Yeah, and the thing about a work of this size is that there's always something to do in terms of editing it. So obviously the entire team were hardcore, lifelong Star Wars fans. So we had a very broad general knowledge of Star Wars that we could bring to the table. And then on top of that, we did sort of have our own specializations. For example, it's not exactly a big secret that Edward Dodds is incomparable when it comes to his knowledge of Sith lore. And obviously, that being a huge part of what SE covers and delves into, that was, absolutely vital. For other authors, for other editors, we each found our niche. Like I said, there was always plenty to do, so we were doing common editorial things such as providing comments and suggestions on what would fit here and there, cleaning up typos, making some recommendations on what should be added here or moved there or potentially taken out altogether. Things like that. But at the end of the day, we all found our niche. And because we were both simultaneously all rowing in the same boat, whilst also having our own different areas of specialization that potentially didn't always overlap with one another. So we would potentially defer to this person on that and this person on this. The result is that we've all built an enormous amount of respect for one another, and also a lot of close personal friendship on top of that. So that's something that I'm very, very grateful to have been a part of.
Yeah, it's like a family, the Supernatural Encounters family. From everything I've heard about it, it sounds absolutely amazing. Here's kind of a specific question with a broader question kind of lying in wait behind it. What is your favorite section of Supernatural Encounters as a fan, as a reader of it? But beyond that, taking it back more to the expanded universe as well, after that question, what is your favorite era of the Star Wars expanded universe, if you had to point to one? It'll be like choosing between favorite children again, perhaps. Yeah.
I'll answer the second one first because that's a bit more of a shorter, direct answer. My favorite period of Star Wars storytelling is the post-Endor era. Because that's largely what I grew up on, and those were some of the formative stories of my childhood, and there's always going to be a lot of nostalgia and affection there. And on top of that, there's a hell of a lot of lore and a hell of a lot of stories set within that period. So it's very grand and vast and sweeping. There's always something going on, and there's about a million things there worth revisiting constantly. In terms of Supernatural Encounters, that is a much, much trickier question because the short answer is that obviously I love all of it. I wouldn't have stayed on as an editor if I wasn't enjoying the hell out of it. I have these memories from pretty much every single chapter where I've had some sort of deep and meaningful conversation with Joe about it. I'll read this chapter for the very first time, and then I'll go to him and say, "Oh, I loved this. Oh, I love what you did with that. Oh, why did you do this? What was the deal with that? Where did this come from?" Typically I had a million questions per chapter, as most readers tend to. And then you finish it, you complete your first read through, and then we're back at it again in terms of the editing and running through each chapter. And so I've read this thing from cover to cover so many times, and I've been blessed enough to have been intimately involved with the creation of each of these to the extent that I genuinely can't pick a favorite. There's a lot of highlights in there, a lot of things that I love. And I'm phenomenally, I can't describe how grateful I am to Joe to have been given the opportunity to take part in this.
I think that about covers what my next question was kind of going to be, which was going to be, as a lifelong Star Wars fan, how special, how important, how meaningful was it to you to get to contribute in this way to the universe that you love so much. But you've kind of answered that a little bit already, but you might have more to say on that, because as a Star Wars fan myself, for the time I've been a Star Wars fan, just imagining getting to be editorial on any piece of Star Wars work, a picture book, a short story, anything, would just mean the world to me. So I imagine this was such a cool experience, especially for a work of this magnitude, this scale that you so love, as you clearly do.
Yeah, I was completely blown away when Joe asked me to come aboard as an editor, and I feel like I have been riding on a high ever since. Obviously, the Disney takeover was it was difficult for me. I was much more fair and open-minded than certain portions of the fandom. I was very committed to giving it a chance. I continue to follow and engage with it to various extents, but having felt like I lost the stories and the universes that were such a formative experience of my childhood and growing up, it felt like I had lost something, and there wasn't going to be any closure for that. And I know a lot of fellow fans have been in that exact same situation themselves and grappled with the exact same feelings. Like I said, I stepped away from the fandom for a fairly significant point of time there. What I think Supernatural does, and what I hope that it does for a lot of people, is that it provides that sense of closure for people that had been lacking and that had been taken away from them so abruptly.
Yeah.
You know, these stories that have existed since 1977, all of a sudden it's over. All of these loose ends, they're never going to be tied up. And obviously SE wasn't, it was outside its wheelhouse to address every single loose end that was out there. But it does address a hell of a lot of them in a story that is, you know, as Thrawn would say, it was so artistically done. And yeah, so having that really meant the world to me. It was this ability to finally have one last dance with my, you know, lifelong love, just sort of throwing myself back at it, getting to dive deeper than I've ever delved before into the lore. And I think that Supernatural Encounters provide, it offers, for those who want it, a nice ending point for the EU, but it leaves so much room and potential for additional storytelling on top of that. And I don't want to give anything away, but there potentially will be some more storytelling on top of that.
It's an absolutely incredible read, and it is exciting that there's some story that's left to tell, even after Supernatural Encounters. It plants seeds in different places for more to be told. It doesn't tell it all. It looks under most of the stones for the secret stories we've been missing, but it leaves a couple unturned, waiting for perhaps later on. To take it back to kind of the beginning of this video, where you said outside of the movies, one of the first experiences with Star Wars, the first interactions you had with Star Wars, was via coming home to play a video game after school. Did you keep up with the Star Wars video games after that? And what are your favorite Star Wars video games? Do you point to Rogue Squadron as being your favorite Star Wars game all the way back then, or do you have other favorites?
I definitely have a lot of nostalgia and affection for the original Rogue Squadron. Obviously, to a certain point, you'll always remember your first, and it was a fantastic video game. I don't think I played the sequels, and despite the sort of upgrade in, you know, graphics and the like, I think that they sort of crested the peak. You know, after the first remained unbeatable to me, but it's nowhere near my favorite Star Wars game. I've played a couple, so a lot of the early ones, such as Galactic Battlegrounds. That's a fun one. You know, Force Commander, Empire at War. That's a fantastic game that a lot of people are still continuing to engage with to this very day through mods.
Yep.
So it really that is a testament to what a good base game it was to begin with, and also just the hardcore passion and dedication of Star Wars fans. Like I said, as a guy who just whipped together a spreadsheet, I'm consistently blown away by some of the things that people are able to do and the passion and hard work and dedication that it absolutely must take. I think so. I played, the Jedi Knights video games. I played the Dark Forces ones. These were ones that I sort of revisited later in life, long after they'd since come out. So I never really shared the same affection and nostalgia that a lot of fans have for them. Perhaps a bit of a contrary take, but I think my favorite one would have to be Jedi Fallen Order, which is one of the more recent ones and one that comes from the Disney canon. It is an incredibly well-crafted game. I couldn't put the damn thing down once I started playing with it. That's also probably the last one that I played as well. I don't get as much time for video games these days, but I like to squeeze it in where I can.
Yeah. And Fallen Order is something that may be referenced several times in Supernatural Encounters. As Supernatural Encounters kind of extends the olive branch to the Disney timeline and says, hop on board. You can come with us a couple of times.
Absolutely. It's always there was a little bit of hand wringing and wrangling with that, because obviously there are some EU purists who will absolutely hate that sort of thing being included. There are some people such as myself who sort of like little bits of the DU and sort of pick and choose what we want from there. And some people who, just sort of love both. One of the things that I found really touching and heartwarming is sort of seeing a younger generation of fans get into the EU via the DU. And they've somehow at a, phenomenally young age have managed to go so deep down the rabbit hole that they've stumbled onto Supernatural Encounters. And I think there's been a little bit of cross-pollination between these different universes that has occurred in other sources such as SWOTOR, which has slipped in a few references there since it's still ongoing. It has that ability and that luxury to do so. No one felt bad about them doing that. Probably some people did, but it didn't blow up in a big significant way. No. I think Joe he creates a broader cosmological framework in which to understand, the EU and the DU as part of a shared universe that sort of potentially connects and overlaps in some ways. Once you make that connection, then it becomes much harder to justify not, sort of excluding the two, or sort of treating them as though never in the twain do they meet, when clearly, to some extent, they do.
That what you talked about is something that I've kind of had to wrestle with and overcome in my own way. Some of my tendencies tend to try to lean EU purist, and so it was interesting to realize how much sense it does make for DU stuff to be within the EU. If these are parallel universes, as might be suggested in Supernatural Encounters, why wouldn't there be overlap in some of the species, some of the planets that we see? It just makes sense, and that's something that I kind of learned to appreciate, learned to like over the course of reading Supernatural Encounters. That has been really cool to see, quite frankly. Back to more generalized stuff, though. Who in the expanded universe do you point to as your favorite character? Now, this is a very hard question. I've tried to make lists of top 10 EU characters that extend for hundreds of names, and other than Dr. Royce Crater, who would you point to in the EU as your favorite character?
I was going to give that as the joking answer and say no, that's a very, very easy question. But yeah, you preempted me there, so I'll have to be a bit more serious and do the hard work of actually digging down deep. Probably my all-time favorite character would. And I imagine that Alex will love this. It's got to be Zane Carrick. Because
Yes.
you have this galaxy and this universe of these larger than life figures, these sorts of heroes and paragons that we can look up to and sort of
Yes.
strive to emulate, and people with sorts of godly levels of power. And then you have Zane Carrick, who feels very much like a sort of a player character in a Dungeons and Dragons adventure, where he's just sort of dumped all of his stats into things that will make him very, very lucky, even though he's constantly rolling nat ones. He's a deeply relatable character who is, he's flawed. He has the Force enough to become a Jedi, but he's very clumsy with it. He doesn't have this control. And you find yourself rooting for this guy, especially as he's thrust into circumstances so wildly over his head. And yeah, I love the KOTOR comics. Like I said, that was how I got into comics in the first place. And in terms of characters, like I said, John Jackson Miller, he really knows how to write a character, and Zane is probably the pinnacle of that, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's a great answer. He's very much like if you took one of us Star Wars fans and plopped us in the Star Wars universe and we're like, you're barely a Jedi, and then we have to cope and just try to stay alive, Great answer. Very relatable character. Sort of another question that I had planned for today is revolving around the esteemed Dr. Royce Crater. Who do you see Dr. Royce Crater as in the Star Wars universe? Have you given any thought to that? What species are they? What are they doing? What are they doing out there in the Star Wars expanding universe? Matt Wilkins answered this when he found out that Wat Milkins was a doctor out there in the Star Wars universe. He said that he's leaving a cantina with Twi'leks on his arms. That was his answer. Is Royce Crater a more reputable, respectable doctor than that, or is he out there cantina hopping, as it were?
It depends on whether or not you find Zeltros more reputable than Twi'leks. I don't want to give too much away, but obviously, as I've mentioned in the past, the Atlas Appendix is very much intended to be the beginning of an evolving project that will cover not just supernatural encounters, but other things that hit Joe's website or things that already have hit his website, such as Heart of the Jedi and the like.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be continuously updated on an as-needed basis. And we may have some potential plans for larger expansions beyond that that may feature Dr. Royce, since obviously he's the stand-in for me, as sort of a framing device that we might use for an introduction or something. So he's not going to be fleshed out too substantially to my mind. I mean, I don't have the luxury of having a supernatural encounter size text to really flesh out his character in the same way that Ahul was. But yeah, I consider him, a bit of a what's a good way of putting it? A bit of a cranky academic who's found himself he's gotten into something that he didn't fully expect. He's someone who helped out with publishing Supernatural Encounters. He's provided his experience. So he's been completely blindsided by all of these revelations that have completely upended all of his assumptions about the world and rather the galaxy and the universe and how it operates. and he's still trying to navigate that. And now that his eyes are opened, he can't shut them again, and this is potentially lending itself to a teeny tiny little bit of healthy paranoia. Where he might be onto something when he sees the galaxy erupt back into war shortly after the release of Supernatural Encounters. He is probably the kind of guy who's looking around and is like, is this a Sith thing? Are the Sith manipulating this to bury the book? Is that narcissistic of me to assume that the galaxy has gone to war because of this book that I've helped to produce?
I definitely hope he survives the Second Galactic Civil War there. Hopefully he's
fingers crossed.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Sounds great. What you're saying about perhaps he'll be used as like an introduction in the future, maybe sounds very reminiscent to me of the way that they used Arhul and Voron Na'al and kind of Plat Okafi and those characters in the West End Games era to kind of introduce something that is set in universe for like source guide related stuff. Would you say that that's probably similar to like Arhul's and Voron's in the way that he could be used?
Yes, 100%. West End Games was probably how I first got into the reference material sides of things. So it was very influential and informative when it came to, identifying my own approach of how I would sort of tackle these things. And I always found the idea of an in-universe framing story surrounding something to be far more interesting and enjoyable than just sort of this being presented to you in a particular way without that. So that's basically what I have in mind for Dr. Royce.
I'm excited to see where Dr. Royce will go in the future. The West End Games stuff is just so phenomenal, as anyone who's explored it knows. But it's kind of hard to access due to expense, out of print. Well, it's on Joe's website, but some people aren't aware of that. But the majority of West End Games is up there. But it's kind of hard to access. Some people think of it all as being RPG related and aren't too interested in that. But there is a lot of depth and really just good stuff in West End Games. Where would you point to within West End Games as some of the standouts, some of your favorite material to have come from the West End Games era of storytelling in Star Wars?
The Rebel Alliance and Imperial source books are sort of must-read introductory texts that really establish a world building around these two factions, flesh out their history, their political structures, their military structures, the kinds of ships they use, pretty much everything that you can imagine. And those still continue to inform the basis of Star Wars lore to this day. If you look at some of the reference guides that have been published by Disney recently in the previous few years, such as the Rogue One visual dictionary, it draws upon lore that originated all the way back in those two West End Games source books. Beyond that, I would highly recommend the adventure journals. These were very fun. It was basically a collection, a little anthology series, there it is right behind you, of things like short stories, RPG adventures, reference material, sort of article types of things, in-universe news features, things like that. It was a grab bag of all of these different fun ideas that weren't just necessarily geared towards people who play tabletop RPGs. There's truly something for everyone in there, so I'd highly recommend those.
They're so fun, and West End Games managed to somehow achieve like a magic that I don't think Wizards of the Coast or Fantasy Flight Games were able to fully emulate with their RPG related stuff. There was just something so special about kind of that era of storytelling. Something you mentioned earlier is
they remain, as far as I'm concerned, the sort of undisputed pinnacle of the RPG side of things for Star Wars. I think that FFG has managed to come close. Certainly, it's a marked improvement over Wizards of the Coast. And one of the things that they have brought to the table was a willingness to actually spend on commissioning new professional art pieces from artists.
Wizards of the Coast was lacking in that.
Breathtaking. Yeah, absolutely. And I believe that at least one of the artists for Supernatural Encounters, they had worked for FFG, correct?
Yes, that's Mr. Guillaume Ducos, who me and Marcel will be interviewing this February. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. In regards to the RPG related stuff, you mentioned earlier the foreign RPGs as something that's so interesting to me as well. Some of these third party RPG related magazines, I have a couple of them, but there's so many of them that have Star Wars related material in them from various countries, various authors. Were they licensed by Lucasfilm? Well, some of them maybe not, but they try to be compliant with West End Games. Very fun stuff, very deep cut lore. You said that you've searched through those. Have you had success in finding some of these foreign RPGs, and what do you think is so special about them?
Yeah, as you alluded to, there's a lot of because there's so many different magazines across different countries as well. There was a bit of a weird situation where some of them potentially were licensed, but people on the LFL side of things aren't able to find the necessary paperwork, even though these people swear that they were licensed. Whereas other people were taking advantage of their existence within international markets, perhaps some laxer laws surrounding intellectual property and copyright, things like that, or just the fact that they thought they wouldn't get caught. Potentially, some of these sort of go back a bit before the internet was so widespread and common, so it was probably a safer bet back then that they would be able to just rip off Star Wars and get away with it. But yeah, it's like I said, I've sort of plumbed the depths of the EU to the point where you're really delving down towards the bottom of the iceberg to find obscure things that are still new to you, and that's very much one of them. Things like Casus Belli in particular, some of those have gone up on the Wook. People have found copies of those and they've translated them and bothered to actually create Wikipedia articles for them that make them a bit more accessible for people. But there are a lot that haven't. And these are Star Wars stories that have a lot of interesting lore, a lot of depth, a lot of quite fascinating connotations, and some of them, they're references to ancient civilizations, some of the things that those were able to achieve. It was we were lucky enough to be able to have access to some of these and include them within Supernatural Encounters.
Yes.
And as I mentioned, I passed along some of the notes that I had and gave them to Joe and sort of let him take that ball and run with it. And I was quite gratified as I was reading through to see a lot of these worked in really fantastic and interesting ways. So I think that I feel that they're part of the broader tapestry of the EU that hasn't been woven in as fully as everything else. And so that has a lot of, that's quite fascinating for me because it's something that I consider Star Wars, and you read these things and they are tonally, quintessentially Star Wars. They get it. The authors got it. And so being able to find these things and discover them for the first time and find something that is wholly and completely new to me, to the point that I'm going in 100% fresh, it's a novel experience and one that I really quite enjoy.
I delighted in the times when I saw references to some of those RPG stuff. Like in the introduction, there's the Sylph species who are coming from some foreign RPG stuff. So super cool that some of that was able to be included in Supernatural Encounters.
Yeah,
Supernatural.
the self. Um, yeah,
Nope, go
the
ahead.
self are an interesting one from an editorial standpoint because they appeared in two different French RPGs,
Yes, they
uh,
did.
and and the stories surrounding them were completely contrary. So the first time that they appeared, they were a race of pacifists from a planet. Uh, I think the pacifists were from Seda Vanaflor.
Yeah,
And in their other appearance, they were a warrior race that had been radicalized into towards committing acts of terrorism against the Republic, and they were from a completely separate world called Sylvia, or Sylvia
yeah.
4 to be exact. And the great thing about SE is because we were playing with those already, it provided the opportunity and the perfect springboard to come in and reconcile that difference and explain why they're depicted in these two completely contradictory ways across different sources.
It just makes me so happy that Joe Bongiorno and the editors team with Supernatural Encounters took the time to iron out that discrepancy, make it all work. Just so great. The beauty of Supernatural Encounters and the EU as a whole. Supernatural Encounters has fundamentally changed the way I view Star Wars in several ways. I assume it has for pretty much anyone who reads it. It's kind of hard for it not to have an impact. So I imagine it's had an impact on you and changed the way that you have viewed Star Wars. What would you point to as some examples of that?
Yeah, probably some of the more mystical elements of Star Wars. Because Star Wars has always had that through the Force, and the
Mm,
idea that the Force potentially has a will of its own that it might be capable of enacting. And there's obviously a lot of significant in-universe debate, particularly between Jedi and Sith scholars, to the extent to which the Force actually is self-aware and has a will, or if it's just a tool, this sort of energy source that you can tap into. And then on top of that, we have all of these different, for want of a better term, deity-like beings, such as the ones of Mortis. We know about the Celestials to a certain extent. They were sort of more vaguely alluded to within the EU and not fully fleshed out, but we know that they were there and capable of quite miraculous feats. And other things like that, the Bedlam spirits obviously being one of the weirder examples, these references to the immortal gods of the Sith. So there were a lot of loose spiritual threads lying around in the
mm,
EU that were never really picked up and tied together within a substantive way. And I understand why they would do that. Obviously, there is an air of mystery that you want to keep alive, and they perhaps were a bit once bitten, twice shy when they tried to provide an explanation for that from the opposite direction in a more scientifically rationalist form through this
yes.
idea of midichlorians, that
Hmm.
you could quantify the exact count of how many of these microscopic organisms a person had in their blood, and that was how they connected to the Force, which was an idea that obviously, to say the very least, was contentious, and it also sat alongside all of these ideas that were quite mystical and spiritual in nature, and sort of spoke to the idea that there is potentially a spiritual reality to the Star Wars galaxy, that there is something
Yeah.
metaphysical beyond the physical, scientifically explainable aspects of the Force.
Mm,
So for me, this stuff has always been there within Star Wars. It's been sitting there, but it was lurking in the background rather than brought to the forefront.
yeah.
And that's something that Supernatural Encounters, basically runs in the complete opposite direction from that. It leaves a lot of mysteries still out there. It doesn't try to explain everything, but for the first time, it actually takes these elements and grapples with them to a substantive degree. to the point that you are left with the feeling that, yes, there are deities within the Star Wars universe, and there are spiritual realities there, and that, the attempts of sort of in-universe figures to explain these phenomena down the line amount to them either just having pieces of the picture, pieces of the puzzle, but not being able to put it together correctly, or this idea of knowledge being lost over countless eons, beliefs eroding, people entering into a sort of more scientifically advanced but spiritually neglectful age, and we can certainly see this through figures such as the Jedi, who originally started off as a religious organization that was involved in studying the mysteries of the Force itself and committed to serving and enacting its will, to one that became bogged down in temporal concerns such as politics, serving the Republic, etc., etc.
Yeah. A lot to unpack there. A lot of great stuff. I'm gonna turn to ask a question that I assume I don't even have to ask. It's one that I asked of Joe when I met him at LegendsCon as well, and that is the entire book of Supernatural Encounters is framed as a debate over the authenticity, really, of these claims of deities within Star Wars, of these metaphysical things you talk of all of these, this large history and body of ideas for what shaped things in Star Wars. And this is presented by one man, and then they're debating, is he a lunatic, basically, who is just, these are mad ravings, or is he making this up, being deceitful, or is this inspired truth that he has seen? And we, the reader, are left to really interpret that for ourselves. Where do you come down on that side of things? Is he a lunatic, or is he giving a window into what happened in Star Wars?
Well, I'm not sure that you can go through everything that Hex went through without becoming a lunatic to some degree. But that's an entirely separate question from whether or not he's factually correct and accurate. So before I go into my own personal views on this, I do want to make it absolutely clear that SE was very deliberately written in a way that was open to interpretation, and that there was never this idea of there is, this us between ourselves sort of sharing the one true interpretation, and then we'll just sort of leave people to guess and figure out what that is. There's no such thing as the one true interpretation of SE, and that's very much by design. So I don't want anyone listening to potentially conflate my own personal views on the subject with some sort of official stance or position that they themselves are required to adopt. And as you said, there are multiple interpretations, including the fact that Hex has fully snapped. And these are just the stark ravings of a man driven insane, and you can completely dismiss it. And insofar as you accept SE into your headcanon, it was just the only part that's true is that Hex wrote this manuscript while having sort of a schizophrenic episode or something similar to that extent, and that's all there is to it. That's obviously not my take. I would strongly disagree with that take, but each to their own. There's an off-ramp there if you really, really don't like the thing for whatever reason. Then there are sort of more literal or allegorical interpretations of this. The more literal interpretations are that the Celestials are divine beings who provided a divine origin for the Star Wars universe, in which the galaxy was created through these various means and then seeded with life. so on and so forth. And then there's the one of the allegorical interpretations. If you study the celestials closely, you'll find that there is a lot of commonality between them and real-world creative figures. And very much this idea that the stories and creative works of fiction that people come up with in our world are given physical life of their own through through the celestials. You know, and there's a lot to unpack there that I will neglect to do so. So I apologise there for sort of teasing that. But it's a very weighty subject when you really delve into who exactly the celestials are and whom they might symbolise. And their interactions with celestials who originated from other realms entirely that are outside the Star Wars universe and potentially completely disconnected from that. In terms of my own interpretation, my personal interpretation of SE, I am very much a textual literalist. It is all true as far as I'm concerned. This is an accurate or at the very least, mostly accurate, leaving some wiggle room for Hex to have gotten certain specific details wrong, but a mostly accurate account of how the Star Wars galaxy came to be. I sort of, as I mentioned before, there were all of these divine and spiritual aspects to the Star Wars galaxy and mystical aspects that were always there in the background, but never really explained or fleshed out. And I've come to the conclusion after many discussions about this, many debates, that the best way in my mind to make sense of that is to acknowledge that there is a spiritual reality to the Star Wars universe, and that's the approach that I've taken, that this is a literal text that provides an accurate account of creation and history going forward.
That's the view that I have when reading Supernatural Encounters as well, with just, like you said, just a tiny bit of wiggle room that perhaps, as Arhul was transcribing it down, his mind was not what it used to be, so maybe one or two details slipped his mind a little bit, but mostly literal. That's where I've come out on it too, because it's just so complex and so thoroughly written that if he's a madman, he was very imaginative in his in his ravings.
Yeah, if he's mad, he's at a minimum a mad genius.
Yeah, he's a master storyteller, even if he's mad.
Yeah, but
yeah.
the potential for wiggle room is important. As you mentioned, Hex and Foreign Null originated from WEG materials, where they were sort of used as in-universe authors of various things, and that turned out to be a very apt decision because they were quite often wrong on certain specific details. Their accounts that were sort of produced in the 80s and 90s didn't age well in terms of future content. So sort of claims that they made were rendered out of date and contradicted by future canon, and having them as an in-universe author immediately creates an out for there that they were just themselves personally wrong. That's sort of you can take that sort of pinch of salt and apply that to Supernatural Encounters if you're so inclined.
And Supernatural Encounters provides a fantastic explanation for, even going back, provides a great explanation for why they were wrong in some accounts when it talks about several times throughout the work, the Imperial propaganda kind of wipe of history. So Arhul and Vorin were basically having to do some shoddy guesswork in those West End Games books, largely in relation to, the Clone Wars era, the prequel era, stuff like that, with some of those dates and some of those accounts being completely not what we would later see.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I've always struggled with particularly was how within a single generation, people could forget so much about the time before the Empire. And for anyone else who grapples with that and has struggled with it to the extent that I have. I highly recommend the comic. It was Purge Tyrant's Fist.
Okay.
And the premise of that comic is shortly after the Empire, a planet with a long history of supporting the Jedi is harboring a Jedi fugitive.
Yeah,
And the
Chona
task
Bene.
for Vader is, yeah, exactly. And the task of Vader isn't just to take out that Jedi, but to stop this planet with hundreds or potentially even thousands of years of history of interaction with the Jedi and making them completely turn against them. And there was a sort of sophisticated ISB effort to completely erase every single trace of history there,
Yes.
to the extent that people were terrified to even acknowledge or talk about the true nature of certain things. And if you take that experience on one planet and extrapolate it out across the whole empire, you sort of start to see how quickly things are forgotten under a totalitarian regime that is more than happy to completely erase, destroy, or alter, entire history to suit its narratives.
That is a fantastic analogy for explaining away that problem. It's a really good comic. It sticks in my mind pictures of Jedi statues, being taken down, sacred places where Jedi once were. These heroes, burned and reduced to rubble. That's a really,
Yeah,
really good point.
There was one incident in particular that really stuck in my mind was they had people on that planet had a tendency to name their kids after famous Jedi, particularly famous
Yes.
Jedi that had interacted with their planet. And so basically the ISB compiled a list of these names, and they forced everyone who had a name like that to legally change their name to something from a pre-approved list of names provided by the Empire. So they were not just erasing history, but people's connection to history and their identification with that history, which is very chilling.
Very
Alexander Freed
chilling
is a
indeed.
fantastic writer.
And history is really originally, in our history at least, orally told from person to person before it's written down. So it really just cleansed their oral history as well, to where they were scared to talk of such things. Change the written history, take away all their statues, change their names, and scare them into not talking about it. It transitions things rather quickly. I can't remember the name of the woman who was going around with Vader, forcing the Empire's will here. It's slipping my mind, but absolutely fantastic comic.
Oni Namada
Was the name of the character.
Yep. I would
Okay.
normally forget a detail like that, so I'm glad that I was able to conjure it up into my head this one time. Hopefully there isn't a quiz round coming up to prove that I can do that more than once.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. So of all of this stuff that we've talked about, we've covered lots of in-depth stuff from Supernatural Encounters. We've covered some of your favorite lore aspects, but here's kind of a broader question, and I've asked this of a couple people in this series, and that is for someone who is maybe a casual Star Wars fan, who has watched the movies, liked the movies, is interested in taking that next step and delving into the expanding universe, which is kind of a daunting task with how much there is in the expanding universe. But what would you say to this person, this theoretical person, about why is that plunge into the rabbit hole worth it? Why is that valuable? Why should they look for what else there is beyond the movies?
Yeah, so I think that we sadly live in a fairly cynical age where it feels like we are constantly dealing with, just this endless reboots and shallow revitalizations and resuscitations of old things that might have nostalgia, potentially involving people who are incapable of recapturing the spirit of the original, because the original emerged within a particular specific context. And if you take it out of that context, then it lacks, it lacks the very thing that gave it its meaning and its resonance in the first place. And you see a lot of franchises, they've gone through multiple reboots, or they have multiple coexisting timelines and universes, and this thing isn't canon, and this thing is quasi-canon, but only within this particular timeline, and so on and so forth. It can be very confusing to wrap your head around if you haven't gotten into it in the first place. What makes Star Wars different and what makes it unique and special in my mind is that there has been a single canon existing since A New Hope came out, that encompasses all of the books, the comics, the video games, everything you can think of within a single shared universe, a single canon. And that can be very, very daunting if you're a newcomer or a more casual fan coming in for the very first time. You wonder where you start. You may not like particular forms of media relative to others. You may not be a gamer or a comics reader or what have you. And so it can be intimidating. But what you'll find is if you sort of dip your toe into the water and you find something there that resonates with you, that you like, there's plenty there to keep you occupied and happy for a very, very, very long time to come, compared to other franchises and universes that aren't necessarily as immersive, and you might commit yourself to them as a passion project for a little while. Perhaps you'll be really quite passionate about it for a couple of years, but there comes a point where it runs out, and sadly the franchise has largely died. Star Wars has something that has been continuous since the 70s. There is something for everyone there, all kinds of kooky flavors, from 70s and 80s camp to 90s. I'm not even sure what you would call the 90s, and I was born there, towards the sort of more serious modern realism, which I find a little bit more bland than some of the more fantastical space opera elements of the past. But nevertheless, there's something for everyone, and it all shares a single interconnected universe. And if you are willing to give that a chance, and you do find something that resonates for you, you'll find it a deeply enriching and rewarding experience.
It's a fantastic answer. Thank you so much for sitting down to talk about the Star Wars Expanding Universe and Supernatural Encounters with me today. And I take great solace in the fact that me and Marcel will get to pick your brain on a separate occasion down the line in the Supernatural Encounters interview series. Maybe get into even more detail than here on the specifics of the great work that is Supernatural Encounters. So thank you so much for your work on Supernatural Encounters and on the Atlas Appendix. Thank you so much for sitting down to talk about all of this with me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much. I'm equal parts excited and dreading sitting down with you and Marcel for more. But this was an absolutely fantastic experience for me. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. And you can connect with Corey and the other editors of Supernatural Encounters on the Sith Council Discord. How do you join that? You can join that, I think, through the Facebook group. You can get on there via Joe's website. You can connect with these guys. They're not that hard to find. And from my experience, they're really nice, really willing to answer questions about the work. Great group of people. And so you'll be able to reach out and contact some of them, I'm sure. Well,
yeah, absolutely. We're a friendly, approachable bunch, so feel free to come aboard and ask us any questions that you'd like. I can't necessarily promise that I'll be able to answer them, but we're at least approachable to being asked about these things.
Yeah, and that's what I've found as well. Nothing but great things from the entire editing team. Great group of people. Really represent some of the best qualities of the Star Wars fandom, in my opinion. So thank you to you guys for watching as well, and we'll see you next time on Talking Star Wars EU.